Good morning, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here and share this panel with my fellow deans, and I want to thank Ollie for the fantastic job that he's done in a very short time to get this center really up and running and impactful and making just a range of very interesting initiatives, including the student competition. I'm going to talk about the unique role of public policy in ethical decision making. The state is different than many other actors because it has sovereignty and it can use force. It's also the basis for private market transactions and social interactions. It forms the legal basis for that, contracts, private property, etc. So in some sense, it's engaged in every single area that's represented up here and in many other areas as well. And it has several instruments that it uses. That's why I use the term public policy rather than just law, because it includes executive orders and a whole lot of other things to make this happen. I would like to go through 5 sort of basic areas. And I believe that a lot of it's important to start with the basics and understand the kind of philosophy about this and then apply it to a particular modern kind of things that Ollie was talking about. But if you just start with those, I think that's not the way to approach it. So it's next generation, but it's based on a lot of work people have done. One of the key trade-offs in public policy is between efficiency, equality, and equity. And the famous work on this is by Arthur Oken, Efficiency versus Equity, the Big Trade-Off. And as you can see, it's the moral principle that individuals and groups should be treated equally before the law and in practice. And one of the big ethical questions is, should that be equal opportunity or should it be equal outcomes? This is a huge area of public policy. Is it all right if we just have opportunity and people end up in very unequal places? And it also depends on the scope of what you define as human rights. If it's just gender and race, et cetera, that's one thing. But many countries extend that to housing, healthcare, voting, and a whole range of other things. And the broader your number of human rights, the more you get into this conflict between equity and efficiency. A second area that's hugely important in public policy is individual liberty versus accountability. It's the ethical trade-off between being able to do as you please, which is a fundamental American value, and the potential cost and harm to others and society. And when I was a kid, it was about wearing helmets for motorcycles and seat belts. Huge political controversy about that, hard to believe today. But today, it's much more about things like buying and selling assault weapons. And that's an individual right, but the potential harm it can cause in terms of the increase in murders and mass killings, et cetera. And this also is a big issue with regard to the internet. It gives everyone access to information, both taking and receiving information in a way we've never had before in our entire lives. But who is accountable for the data? And should anybody be accountable for the data? And obviously this recent case, Facebook versus Cambridge Analytica, brings that to the fore. Also, is Facebook a technology company or is it a content provider? What is its responsibility here? And then finally, can anything be put on it? We were discussing how China tries to restrict some of the darker sides of the internet, et cetera. Related to that is the individual and authority. The classic book on this is actually Eichmann in Jerusalem. I made a mistake. I put it as Eichmann on trial, but Eichmann in Jerusalem and the Stanley Milgram experiments that were done at Stanford. And the basic idea here is that when you're under structure of authority, say in a hierarchy in a private company or a government agency, you're more inclined to do things to harm others than you would if you're just operating individually by yourself. And there's been a lot of experimental evidence that shows that. That was Eichmann's defense, right? That he was a transportation engineer and he was just following orders, et cetera, during the Holocaust and so on. So who is accountable in this situation? It is the individual, the company. The big issue today, of course, is around sexual harassment and the Me Too movement, and do authority relations in that setting facilitate those kinds of behaviors of people. One of the other big areas of public policy is private benefits versus public goods. This is worldwide. There's a collusion that is very tempting between private interest and public leaders to aggrandize themselves. Kleptocracies are the worst example of that. It's in the form of corruption and rent-seeking, and this is rampant around the world, including in our country. We have a lot of rent-seeking that still goes on. What it does is it reduces the overall economic efficiency and output of the economy to the benefit of specific individuals. Vladimir Putin, for example, is a multi-billionaire, and I'm sure he doesn't get that salary as the premier of Russia. He gets that by extracting rents from industry captains, and these captains of industry also get very, very wealthy. And the classic book on this, of course, is Mansur Olson's The Logic of Collective Action. Another aspect of this is that as people gain economic benefits, and like in our country, there's huge economic inequality. It's really quite remarkable. It also leads to political inequality, and that political inequality can lead to policy outcomes that have ethical issues to them. And the best study of this is Martin Gillen's and Ben Page, Democracy in America, What Has Gone Wrong? And I'm quote here, when the preferences of economic elites and organized special interests are controlled for, basically the average Americans appear to have only a minuscule, non-significant impact on public policy. And they studied 2,000 policies over 15 years to try to come up and came up with this result. And then, of course, you have the tragedy of the commons and externalities, in which a lot of private market transactions have externalities to them, and the question is how much should those be regulated or not. My daughter, who just arrived last night, she works for Wolverine Corporation, and they're under a suit now because they had a tanning company. It's a boot manufacturer. You know, they make Merrell boots, and they've been polluting the groundwater in Michigan for many, many years, and they have a whole history of disease, et cetera. And the company is in real trouble over this. But the best book, when you think of climate change in this context, in the world as a whole, is Jared Diamond's book, Collapse: How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed. And then finally, as I mentioned at the beginning, the public policy is in a unique position in that it can use force and violence to achieve its ends. And that in itself becomes an ethical question. You know, we have just up in Sacramento, the killing of the young black man unarmed. We see that all across the country. This is what this is about in part. How much force should the state use in different kinds of situations? We also, as you know, the U.S. has actually executed foreign leaders at various times. Other countries do this, the use of force, huge ethical issues when you get to drones. And, you know, who's accountable? Is it the machine or the person running the machine, the system? Huge ethical issues there. War and violence as a means of public policy, and the classic work on this is Ken Walt's Man, the State, and War. So quick breeze through some of the major ethical questions in public policy, sort of the fundamentals of those, and you need to understand these fundamentals before you can go into specific policy areas, I think. So thank you very much.
All right. So my name's Laura Mosqueda. I'm a family physician and a geriatrician. So I specialize in care of people of all ages, but particularly older adults. And in family medicine, we learn about what's called the biopsychosocial spiritual model of practicing care, a very holistic approach, which is very helpful in geriatric medicine. And I'll come back and talk a little bit more about that at the end. I thought I would just sort of give you a smorgasbord of tantalizing ethical issues that are currently in medicine and also coming up, since this is called the next generation, had an X in the name of it, so I knew I had to do something futuristic whenever you see an X in the name of anything. So what I'm going to do is talk about a few societal issues, then talk a little bit about technology, and then make it personal for all of you and for all of us in the room. I would say the most important ethical issue facing us related to medicine is one that's been around for a very long time, and that is lack of access to health care for all. If you believe, as I do, that healthcare is a right, that access to healthcare is for everybody, is actually a mark of a civilized society, then Houston, we have a problem. The implications for not having access for all are great, both in terms of longevity, include issues related to physical fitness, intellectual fitness that happens, things that are set not only in young ages, but even in utero that we know more and more about, and just where we are, what we believe as a society. There were some attempts made with this, with things like the Affordable Care Act, which certainly had its flaws. But I will tell you what was interesting to me, as somebody who works with students who provide care at a homeless shelter in downtown Los Angeles, is even though these people are homeless, they knew who their primary care provider was. And I feel that it might be slipping away. So I think that's an important ethical issue for us to grapple with. Mr. Sales said in the introduction, whether you're Democratic, Republican, Independent, or I don't care. And my plea is, please don't be in the I don't care. Choose something, but don't be an I don't care, because there's a lot to care about and a lot of work that we have to do. So improving access to care, this growing issue of the haves and have-nots, I think is very important and has major health implications for our society. The second thing I'll mention that I think is sort of a big picture societal level is the ability to practice medicine with integrity. That's becoming increasingly difficult as well. And in fact, there's a lot of conversation now about physician burnout. Certainly physicians have a very privileged position in our society. We make a lot of money, but this burnout is absolutely incredible. We now have, on average, a physician committing suicide every day in this country. And there's a lot of conversation about what's going on. And as we dig deeper and talk about what is it that is causing this sort of moral despair among healthcare providers, part of it is I can't provide the kind of care I want to provide. Our financial incentives are not aligned with providing the best kind of care that we can. How will we have a healthcare workforce who is prepared and able to provide the kind of care needed when we have this sort of problem going on among people who are supposed to be providing care? Now, I think that technology will help answer some of that, that we'll have technology able to provide certain kinds of care that for example, there will be less need for radiologists because we'll have x-rays being interpreted by computers. We probably will have less need for certain kinds of nursing care because we'll have robots that are able to help transfer and position patients, et cetera. But we still have to deal with the healthcare workforce issues and still the empathy and compassion that's needed among our healthcare workforce. And I look forward to figuring out how technology can actually help improve empathy and compassion. So as we start working with technology and looking at things like computer-read x-rays, pretty soon, in fact, to a certain extent, we can already do this. You can plug in your symptoms and have a computer tell you either what your problem is or give you a differential diagnosis of what your medical problem is. Then what should we be training our healthcare providers for in terms of how we're going to help interpret this? Will people want us to help interpret this? And if so, how? What will that look like? I don't know what to do right now when somebody comes in with their Fitbit data and dumps it onto my proverbial lap. We still don't know what to do with that and how to even interpret it. Are the same data that were relevant for understanding interpretation of blood pressure, heart rate monitoring, et cetera, that we do on these one-time visits to the doctor's office or a couple times when you're at home? Do we interpret that the same as this continuous data? We don't know the answer to that. A lot of assumptions are getting made, and we don't know if these assumptions are accurate. That scares me because in medicine, we have a long history of making assumptions that turn out to be inaccurate and, in fact, harmful to people. So we need to be careful about that. Another issue I want to turn to is shortages. And that's shortages of things like critical medications, which, again, you'll hear this theme, lack of financial incentives or improperly aligned financial incentives. And these aren't for the fancy medications, the fancy highfalutin medications that are coming out, because people can make money off of those quite easily these days. No, it's going to be more for things like normal saline, which we recently had a critical shortage of related to the hurricanes that occurred, because most of it is made in Puerto Rico. And there's not a big profit motive for generic medications and for the day-to-day medications that people need. So it's shortages of sort of the cheap stuff, if you will, that are actually the real life-saving medications for people. One thing we have to be careful of, as I will say as a geriatrician, I have stopped more medications than I've ever started. And so I do think we're in an overly medicated society. But there are some times when medications are genuinely needed and genuinely life-saving or genuinely improve quality of life. We also have shortages of things like organs. And where are we going to be going with that? We're looking at developing artificial organs, or at least parts of organs that are artificial. But we also are looking at things like organ transplantation. Is it okay to pay somebody for their kidney? How much is it okay to pay? At what point does it become coercive and taking advantage of people who are in the have-not category? These are things that we have grappled with and will be continuing to grapple with. I want to turn for a minute and just drop a few hints about technology. We've already seen that people who have pacemakers and insulin pumps can be hacked. Now, Sherlock Holmes was based on a physician, and I think it would be very interesting to try and detect a possible murder related to manipulating somebody's insulin pump or something like their pacemaker. But more than theoretically, that is possible. And as we have more wearable and connected devices to our physiology, we're going to have to figure out how to protect them from getting hacked or controlled at a distance when we don't want them to be. Now, of course, technology can also augment human capabilities. It can make us healthier, smarter, faster. The question, though, is, are we going to now increase the divide between the haves and have-nots? What will I do 20 years from now when a patient who is healthy comes to me and says that they want me to replace their limbs with robotic limbs because they work so much better? Are we prepared to answer those questions, or at least grapple with those questions in an intelligent, thoughtful way? What will we do when microscopic robots are surging through our blood vessels, things that were injected with our permission, perhaps, that are detecting disease and sending alerts to our smartphone or our digital contact lens, telling us that an infection is brewing before we develop a disease? Will terrorists be able to hack the nanorobots that are surging through our veins? What will we do with this information when we find out that have a very early stage lung cancer, for example? You know, we jump on, well, great, we can take care of it early and cure them, but sometimes we forget that that requires an intervention, and it may be that may never grow and develop into a cancer that actually affects that person's life. We simply don't know the answers to some of these questions. What will happen with IVF, with vitro fertilization technology? Are we going to be okay with people selecting the most intelligent embryos to be implanted? What will happen with gene editing kinds of issues, with CRISPR technology that many of you have probably heard of? Sounds good, let's eliminate heritable disorders. You know, but people who have cerebral palsy or people who are born deaf don't consider themselves lesser than. So what will we gain by eliminating some heritable disorders, and what will we lose by eliminating some of those as well? We have, of course, 23andMe generation, lots of people checking their genes. What are you going to do with that information now that you know that you have a 62.8% risk of developing Alzheimer's disease? How will that change your life for better and for worse? And are you prepared to think about the impact that will have on you, not just you emotionally, but your insurance company when they ask you if you have any known risk factors that they ought to be aware of when they're talking to you about things like long-term care insurance and health insurance. Finally, I'm going to end with what's near and dear to my heart, geriatrics, some end-of-life sorts of issues. And I want to just read something to you that came across yesterday from Kaiser Health News, and I'll quote directly. Treading into ethically and legally uncertain territory, a New York end-of-life agency has approved a new document that lets people to stipulate in advance that they don't want food or water if they develop severe dementia. Quote, developing incapacitating dementia is certainly my and a lot of people's worst nightmare. And I would dare say that's true for many of us because we're in probably a very hyper-intellectual room. No offense, or take it as a compliment. However you want to do it, doesn't matter to me. So this document offers two options. One that requests comfort feeding. If I'm ever severely ill, if it seems like I'm opening my mouth and seem to be enjoying getting food or liquid, that you can keep providing assisted eating and drinking, because people in end-stage dementia stop being able to feed themselves, and so they need to be fed in the end stages. So they're saying, normally what we do is we continue to feed. But some people are saying that is just a prolonged dying process. But critics now say that's a disturbing effort to allow withdrawal of basic sustenance from the most vulnerable in our society. So in the New York document, this is a direct quote, my instructions are that I do not want to be fed by hand, even if I appear to cooperate in being fed by opening my mouth. The decision that this person is making is, if and when I have end-stage dementia and am no longer able to feed myself, I don't want anybody to feed me. Allow me to die a natural death. However, critics are saying that it misses a crucial point, that people who don't have dementia now can't possibly know how we'll feel later, yet we're deciding to forego nourishment. But it's a catch-22, because by the time you're in that situation, you're no longer able to state what your preferences are. However, there are already people who are putting this directive in place, and I'm sure it will be going through the court system. I'll end with a quick story, and this is a house call I did last weekend on an 87-year-old woman who has advanced bladder cancer. When I went there, it's a Hispanic family living in a very small, cramped conditions. There were 4 generations there. The 4th generation so small that they couldn't really participate, but truly a whole family there loving and caring for this lady. She had gone through chemotherapy and was just absolutely wiped out by it. And her family adored her and was pushing for her to keep getting care. She didn't want the care, but she didn't know how to talk to them about it. And so we were able to sit together and talk about what her options are, one of the options being that it's time to stop all of this. But she really needed a healthcare provider by her side, helping to advocate for her and lead her and her family through this very loving conversation about the potential of technology, the potential that was being offered her by the oncologist, by the cancer specialists, but the reality of this woman's life and what she did and did not want for herself. And she did decide to stop treatment. And in fact, last night, she passed away comfortably at home, surrounded by family. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. So I come from the world that everybody says is totally unethical. So the opportunities for us are immense to do things properly. I spent 27 years in the business world before I came to USC. And there are 2 types of ethical dilemmas that you face in business, one of which is organizational, and the second of which is personal. There's a convergence at a number of times in those two issues, but let's talk about them separately for just a minute. Organizationally speaking, you're making decisions on the fly, and you're making decisions very, very quickly during the course of a day, a month, a year. And those decisions from an ethical standpoint can be relatively simple, and they can be very complex. If I listen to what Jack Knott said about how public policy comes into play, that makes many of those decisions extremely complex. You are the CEO of the Remington Arms Company. Should you even be making guns? When you get into the public policy question, that's a question. Relative to just a product, there's lots of rationalization as to why you would do things. So if you look at it from an organizational standpoint, the one thing we have to remember is that our stakeholders are trusting us. And the key word is trust. The word is trust when we look at Facebook and we look at what transpired. We give our data to Facebook. We trusted them. How did they handle that data? Now, we give our data to Equifax, TransUnion, the same way. Equifax was hacked. They didn't sell that data, but they very quickly tried to correct the situation and what had happened with the hack. Facebook did the opposite. They sold the data. And they sold the data without telling us. Equifax could do the same thing. They have way more data. They have way more on us. Under Armour was just hacked yesterday. 150 million. And it was basically back to what Laura said about Fitbit data being hacked. Everything except credit cards. They very quickly, in trying to exhibit trust, very quickly came out and said, we've been hacked, we've got to solve this. So things happen, but it's also how you react to those kinds of things from an organizational standpoint. There are decisions that take place organizationally in accounting, in finance, in sales, in marketing, in production. I remember the first time I went to Asia as a young retail department store buyer, and I was negotiating the best price with a Chinese factory for flannel shirts. I kept driving the price down, and finally I thought, they're going to give me a shirt with 2 left sleeves. So I had to take the price back up a little bit. I was worried about what might happen there. And interestingly enough, in the business world, there are international ethical dilemmas as well, because our cultures are different. Bribery is part of a number of cultures around the world. For you to do business, you have to give them money to even do business with them. There's dumping that goes on in markets. We have too much inventory, let's just go dump it in another market. That's not ethically correct. And yet we have to do it to get rid of products somewhere. So as the CEO of the company, you have this dilemma that you face. And you have been entrusted by your stakeholders, whether your stakeholders are shareholders, whether they're employees, whether they're customers. You have been entrusted by that group of people to run that company in the right manner. Now, let's talk about it from a personal standpoint. You are the CEO of the company. Your job is to maximize shareholder value. You do that by generating profits. You generate profits because the market looks at you on a quarterly basis. Somebody analyzes you every 3 months. Now, that's a really tough thing to do. And so your business doesn't look very good. So what do? You keep the month open a couple of extra days so you can record those sales days and bring them back into that month or that quarter. Or you don't record expenses and you push those out and take the sales. There's lots of games you can play. But because you benefit as the CEO, that temptation is always there for the CEO to not do the right thing. And it's very, very difficult. We look at it just here at USC. We have situations with privacy. We've been entrusted by 19,000 sets of parents to take care of their kids as they come through their undergraduate program and to protect them. Day before yesterday, we had a rapper come into 2 of our classrooms, jump up on the table of professors in those 2 classrooms and start dancing to music that came in with him with a camera. Now that was absolutely rude, wrong, and not right. And what happened to us? Because we had been entrusted to protect the privacy of our students. That could have been a shooter. Fortunately, it was just a stupid rapper who thought he was being cool and wanted wanted to go back and brag about it on Instagram. We need to protect our students here the same way. Do we have ethical dilemmas? Yeah, we have them all the time. Dr. Harrington goes through it a lot. I'm sure that if she wanted to, she could raise a lot of money for the University of Southern California by accepting gifts from parents whose children are applying to the university. We don't do that. There's a firewall. And so we have to make sure that we protect the institution for which we work. And we have to do the right thing. When I talk to students, I tell them a story about me personally that kind of taught me quite a lesson. And I'll finish with this. I had been fired from a company because I had a completely different philosophy of how to run the business. And I was number 2 and my boss was number 1. So guess who won? And so I was really distraught. I was 32 years old. I had achieved a lot already. I was really upset. I got in my car to drive home. And as I tell the students, what do you think happened when I got in the car? I started to cry. I was really upset. And then about 15 seconds later, I said, all right, dry up. You got to go find a job. And the minute I got home, I called an old boss. And I said, I just got fired. Didn't do anything wrong. We just had a disagreement on the way to run the business. So there's nothing wrong here. Do you have any opportunities for me? He said, yeah, I do. Let me get back to you tomorrow. Tomorrow being Friday. I'll call you tomorrow afternoon. So in the meantime, I'm panicked. I don't have a paycheck coming in. I'm a single guy. I'm taking care of myself. What do I do? So I start calling and setting up interviews. And I set up a bunch of interviews for next week. Well, Friday afternoon at 5:15, he calls me back. He says, I want to offer you the job. This is what I want you to do. I need you to come and help me turn a division around. And this is how much money I'm going to pay you. And it was an okay salary. And I took the job. I said, thanks. He said, I want you to start a week from Monday. Okay, you got it. So now I got to start canceling all these interviews I have next week. We don't have cell phones. We don't have email. And I have an appointment in Northern California at 8 o'clock on Monday morning. I can't get to the guy. Don't know where he lives. I can't get to him to tell him I've taken this job, so I decide to go on the job interview. I want to learn about the company. It actually is relatively close to competing with what the company I was going to work for. And I go up there and spend the day. And as I look back on it, I kind of go, why didn't I say something at 8:05? But I didn't. And I went through the entire day. And they said, God, great to have you here. Thanks a lot. I got on the plane. I flew back home. And I said, well, that was fun. I learned a lot. I felt good because now I was done with the interviews and I was ready to go take my job Monday morning. I get a call at 8 o'clock that night from the senior vice president of HR, and he says, the job we were interviewing you for is truly beneath your expertise. We have created a job one level above that we want to offer you. And your salary is Y. X that I had been offered and Y that I just was offered was a difference of 4X. 4X. Pretend it's $100,000. One offers me 100. I'm helping guys that aren't so quant-oriented. One offers me 100 and one offers me 400. I said, can I get back to you? Shaking like a leaf, sitting in my house by myself. Guy says, sure, call me tomorrow. So now what do you do? Now, when I ask the students, you should hear the answers I get. You can imagine the answers I get. Then I said to the students, what should I really do? They kind of look at me. I said, well, let me tell you what I did. I called my dad. Dad, here's my situation. He said, what'd you tell the first company? So I told him I'd take the job. Dad, it's 4 times as much money. Do you know how much money this is? He said, what'd you tell the first company? Dad, you know what I told him? I just told you. Then what are you calling me for? Yeah, sorry. He says, you knew the answer. I said, yeah, you're right. Ethical dilemmas can come home to roost very, very quickly. And they can come home to roost whether it's a personal one or whether it's one when you're running a huge organization. And I think what we have to do is just remember that we've been entrusted by organizations to do what is right. And that makes decision-making extremely easy to do, where ethics doesn't become a problem. So thank you, everybody. I appreciate it.
I would like to talk to you about why ethics are intrinsic to any technology. I think technology is intrinsically related to ethics. And particularly, I like to talk about the exponentially changing world that we're living in here, which makes actually this is even more important. I'm using for all of you a very simple definition of technology. This is something that I have borrowed, paraphrased from Brian Arthur, who wrote a very nice book called The Nature of Technology. And my definition, which I use to all students, constituencies, parents, and everyone, is that technology is leveraging phenomena for useful purposes. I don't use here anything that includes equations, devices, algorithms. I say leveraging phenomena for useful purposes. Incidentally, what I'm discussing to you today here is available on your handout. In the past, technology was mostly dealt with physical phenomena. Technology goes back to military, the war, way back, in the centuries. Then chemistry became important to technology. Now we have a lot more biology part of technology. And in addition to that, you have social phenomena and behavioral phenomena that become a lot bigger part of technology. So we are spanning in an increasing complexity sequence from physics all the way to how society works and also human behavior. I mean, lots of the things that we do in computer science now today involve also how people behave as well. And that is an important part of technology. So the question was asked before, is Facebook a technology company? In that sense, yes, because it also deals with social phenomena. I think the convergence between disciplines is something that we witness every day, and this will accelerate as the world is changing. This convergence of physics, chemistry, biology, behavior, and social phenomena is something that is a characteristic of our time. And technology now allows us to address big type of problems, the problems that are called grand challenges. These are problems, for example, the National Academy of Engineering articulated 14 grand challenges. I try to look at technology as addressing Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but in this time for society, not for the person itself. And we're talking about sustainability as society, security as part of society, health as part of society, and enriching life, which is also something that technology does in increasing ways as well. We see it all the time in terms of entertainment, but we also see it in terms of personalized learning in many other aspects as well. This convergence, and I capture it in something which I call, so Laura mentioned X. So here's an X for you, Laura, is what I call engineering plus X. And X here is anything. Indeed, this is what we see in the technology evolution. It's partnership of engineering or technology tools with other fields as well. This could be media, medicine, entertainment, biology, education, you name it. This is what we see in front of us. Innovation itself is a convergence activity because it's an activity that involves the partnership of technology, business, so it is feasibility, viability, and desirability, which is the connection, the client discovery type of exercise in which for technology to be successful, of course, you have to be satisfying certain needs of society in order for this to take off. The question that is increasingly happening is, what if X involves humans or society? And this is increasingly the situation that we deal with technology. For instance, autonomy, driverless cars, automation, AI for social good, which is one center that we have here at USC, combining artificial intelligence with social work. So these are aspects that we see happening in the world today, and this happen faster and faster. Now, an important word that it was in my definition, leveraging phenomena for useful purposes, is the word useful. Because useful links phenomena with the leveraging. And so useful is obviously not an objective word, it's a subjective word, because it depends on the eye of the beholder. What's useful for someone may be not useful for somebody else. And we see, therefore, these unintended consequences that are very characteristic of technology. Technology, as Ali mentioned earlier, is amoral. There is no morality associated with technology, at least so far. Maybe in the future, robots will have morality about them. We don't know whether we can endow such machines with this. I just read an article earlier today about with the headline, "Algorithms should be accountable." In a way, asking machines to be accountable, because algorithm is sort of a mathematical something that it doesn't have a human characteristic to it. But this useful aspect of technology immediately evokes ethical and legal questions, unintended consequences, the complexity that comes with unintended consequences, as well as issues of policy, legislation, and regulation. So I'd like to show you a couple more slides, and I will start with this one. I think Ali mentioned this earlier. And the question is, how do we make decisions? Ideally, decision-making should be at the intersection of three circles: smart, legal, and ethical. If you wanted to make a decision that it is really sound, it better be smart, it better be legal, and it better be ethical. Do these three circles overlap, and do they have a common intersection? Hopefully, they do. Often, you actually may make decisions that could be smart and could be legal, but perhaps not ethical. I think this was a question that Jim mentioned just a moment ago. Or you can make a decision that it is hopefully smart and ethical and legal at the same time. Many startups, when they started technology, they start operating at exactly that intersection. When you start a company, you say, I would like my company to do X, and this will solve Y problem for society. It will be ethical, it will be legal, and it will be smart. And that's how disruption takes place. However, as the evolution, let's say, of a startup happens, it may actually provide unintended consequences, and I will show this in a final slide here. Before going there, I just wanted to also point out something that it is characteristic of our times. Technology is moving exponentially fast. The world is changing at unprecedented rates. There are no steady states anymore. There are no steady states of growth anymore. Everything is exponentially accelerating. And what is happening is that society, the policy and legislation and regulation that Jack mentioned before, operates at a different characteristic time. So what happens is that technology is moving ahead of regulation and policy, and legislative bodies and regulatory bodies are slow to catch up. That's why you see all these new problems that evolve all of a sudden that we're not able to solve yet, and you get these consequences that happen as a result of this particular disruption. So one of the fundamental characteristics of our times is that the world is changing exponentially fast. The society at large responds at a much slower rate. And I think that is a fundamental question, how to bridge this gap. I think this explains all kinds of social phenomena. You can be political and explain the elections across the world that are happening nowadays. You can explain policies that are going on or things that are happening in today's world. I use it all the time. And actually, I like to think that we have to teach our students with mindsets that follow the exponential. I call it hug the exponential, rather than have fixed mindsets, which are the mindsets of all times in which change happens relatively slow. I will now come to my final sort of schematic here. So this is an artist schematic. Artist is me. It's not a good schematic. Let's assume that this is the evolution of a new technology. So the first plane is a time t equal to 0 when the technology starts. It starts with respect in the circle of the smart, legal, and ethical intersection. But as time increases, you have these unintended consequences that come out. The unintended consequences that come out are the blue branches that you see there. I have them as blue branches, and as you can see, these blue branches don't follow the core technology, which will continue being smart, legal, and ethical, but they go outside this particular core, and these are branches that perhaps are smart and perhaps unethical. And I think this is what you see. You see this in violation of privacy rights. You can see this in all kinds of the place where technology and society collide or interact. The possibility for malfeasance, bad actors, as well as unintended consequences is real. And the question, therefore, is what do you do with these unintended consequences as an owner of the technology that you start? Are you responsible for cutting or pruning off these unintended consequences? And in my little document that I wrote there, I ask, should we create another CEO? In this case, will be Chief Ethics Officer for a corporation, not to simply impose sort of ethics within, individual ethics of the type we discussed before, how a specific individual reacts to another specific individual, but rather a bigger ethics about how is your technology evolving, and should you be anticipating these unintended consequences in advance, and what kind of role you can play there. So I think this is the type of dilemmas I think that we're going to face in this exponentially changing world. I will finish with some characteristics of summary of technology ethics. Clearly, we're having a synergy of humans with technology. You hear words such as human-machine interaction, human-building interaction, socially assisted robotics. This is a place where humans and machines interact. I think when we deal with big data, machine learning, algorithms, in some sense, these are machines, if you think about it, and the interaction with society and humanity are important. Autonomy and the symbiosis of machines with humans. The impact of automation on human labor, employment, and also income. This is something that was discussed before, how technology displaces labor and the corresponding effects on it, given the fact that technology moves so fast, society's adaptation to this is actually slow and therefore creates additional important questions. Personalized customization, medicine, personalized medicine, to preferences and human desires. That's another part in the violation of privacy. Machine learning and AI that models and leverages human and societal behavior. People talk about WMD, weapons of math destruction, how math can actually be used in terms of machine learning and statistics to somehow disrupt things in a way. For instance, machine learning algorithms include, for predicting human behavior, include biases that already exist in the system. How do you eliminate these biases? How do you make sure that future action that it is dictated by such algorithms does not include the biases that society has already incorporated? Finally, one of the National Academy of Engineering grand challenges is reverse engineering the brain. How do you understand how the brain works? This is fantastic because we can cure diseases like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's and dementia and depression and things of that type. However, this brings us closer and closer to ask the question, what does it mean to be human? Because ultimately, the way we think and the way we act is a fundamental question. So this, again, is another potential unintended consequence. The same thing applies to synthetic biology. I think that Laura mentioned that as well. What does it mean to be human in today's world? And this is a question will be asked more and more, I think, in the future. Finally, I should mention that as an action item, the most important thing that I would like to point out here is that in engineering schools, we have to make sure that our students understand these important questions because they will be the stewards and the creators of new technologies. and we have to make sure that we provide them the education needed in order to be able to understand it, because they will be in the control of this for the foreseeable future. So thank you very much.
Could you mention perhaps the biggest ethical issue that you anticipate is whether in the current generation or in the next generation in each of the different fields? So perhaps we'll start with Jack.
I think one of the biggest ethical issues that we're going to face is this intersection between technology and the ability of the public policy to keep up with that technical change. This gap that Yannis has talked about is widening, and it is raising a whole series of unanswered questions, both in terms of who we are as individuals, as he mentioned, but also its impact and all these unintended consequences. And I think that interaction is, I don't know if it's the biggest, but it is certainly one of the most unique that we face at this moment in history.
Yeah, it's not possible to pick a biggest because they're different, just as I talked about when I was at the podium. I'll just maybe add one additional one that hasn't been brought up yet, but I was thinking about it when Yannis was talking just about what is it to be human, and that is how we can start controlling behavior, right? We now know that a little shot of dopamine can help you feel good. Can we start using that for behavioral control? Could be good, right? If we do something related to motivating behavior in the direction we want, like every time you eat a carrot instead of a cookie, you can get some external little blip of dopamine, but can it also be misused in different ways? And as we understand more and more about the brain through reverse engineering and other techniques, how can that both be used for good and but also for evil, shall we say?
I think that the biggest ethical dilemmas in my world would defer to those in Laura's world. I think that what happens in the medical field and how we impact people, one of which is just the protection of privacy of information. Information's all over the place, and how do we protect that? But then how do we utilize the medical field properly to do what needs to be done to take care of people the right way and not over, as you said, on it. So I think I would defer all of my answers to her. I think from a business standpoint, it really is the fact that we have this incredible database in every single company. How do we properly use those databases to affect change? And I think that's a big question.
I don't think there's a single one, but certainly, the overarching theme is how technology and society responds in a way that it benefits society at large. But one other thing that I forgot to add there would be communication. How do you communicate factually to the world at large the fundamental questions that exist? And how do you make sure that people understand the facts and be able to be informed in a way that allow them to participate in a decision-making process that actually is factual and not hijacked by agendas or other things of the same.
All right, second question, and this is also again for all four deans. What is the role of a research university in promoting ethical decision-making, and what are you doing about it?
Well, I think there's a huge role for research universities, both in the educational area. Yannis pointed this out, all of us pointed this out, that when we are working with our students, whether we're talking about public policy, whether we're talking about technology, medicine, et cetera, business, all of those areas have key ethical dimensions to them. And it's very important, I think, that students learn those ethical dimensions. One of the issues that we have, for example, in our school is, we tend to put one or two courses around ethics and professional ethics, and then that's boxed off and that's where it is. And I think that's a mistake. I think that these kinds of issues need to be infused throughout the curriculum and become part of how we think about different policy areas. This is also true for research. Public policy in particular, that research in that area involves ethical choices all the time. It involves these kinds of questions that I discussed, and that actually almost all of these other presentations involve public policy ethical questions. So I think when people do research, the understanding what those ethical issues are is fundamental. And so we're both going to do it in terms of the educating the next generation and in terms of the kind of research we produce and identifying and trying to think through what the ethical dilemmas are and how to resolve them.
Well, I mean, I think this conference and the Neely Center is just a nice example of what a leading research university ought to be doing in the field of ethics, and we need to be doing more of it. In terms of the Keck School of Medicine specifically, we do a lot in the area of bioethics, and we have great folks like Professor Alexander Capron who helps teach ethics, but we also infuse it throughout the curriculum so that when students, even literally their first week of school, they're interacting through a course called Introduction to Clinical Medicine with patients, and we're talking about ethics during the first year, and it gets infused throughout all 4 years. There are certainly lots of opportunities for ethical dilemmas in medicine that come up frequently. And the other piece where I think we especially need to do a better job is talking about our ethical responsibilities to our communities in our role as healthcare providers for that. So that's a particular area I'm interested in emphasizing more.
If we look at the role of a research university, it really is two things, one of which is to produce knowledge, and the second is to disseminate knowledge. The producing of knowledge, the researchers really need to be looking at what are the issues that are coming to the fore, particularly relative to technology, and what are the burdens that those are going to put on our population, and how do we address those? And then secondly, when we talk to our students, I totally agree with Jack. People will say to us, do you teach a course at the business school in ethics? We do that, but we distribute ethical discussions throughout every single course at the business school. Every professor has a component of ethics in their class, because ethics are very different when you're looking at courses in finance and marketing and operations and strategy. And so we need to continue to talk about it, continue to emphasize it throughout the curriculum so that our students you can't tell students, do this, don't do this, do this, don't do that. That's not the way they're going to learn. They're going to learn from stories. And the ethical stories that come out. What did someone do in a situation? And now what would you have done? And so we need to continue to ask those questions and have those discussions in our classrooms.
So in my simplistic diagram that I showed you before, I assume that the circles remain constant as a function of time, that they move up together like this, like cylinders. But it seems to me that technology also may influence the way ethical behavior, the perimeter of ethics is defined. I think in some sense, maybe this is a study of anthropology or how the world reacts to new technology and what does it mean with respect to how ethical values, our values changing. Do our values change? Would we need to increase our values in some sense or reaffirm them perhaps? And I think this is a potentially a very good area of study in which people can, and I'm looking at not again at the individual behavior of individuals in terms of ethical decision making, but rather the role of technology at large on how it shapes up our world. And I think that probably is a fundable NSF proposal. Someone can write a proposal like that. Or maybe it's already been funded by somebody. So I think that's really what I see as an important area.